It happened when I was in 6th grade. I was on my way home by subway with my mom, and a man with a paper bag was standing in front of us. He kept staring at me, and feeling burdened, I tried to ignore him by borrowing my mom's cell phone and watching YouTube. However, the man suddenly said,
"She looks a lot like my daughter."
I was surprised at first, but quickly relieved of my alertness since it seemed he has no dangerous intention. Mom replied, "Oh, thank you," and tried to stop talking to him, but he continued.
"My daughter is pretty too. She seems to be about the same age as my daughter, and you must be having a hard time taking the subway so late at night."
Then he handed us a paper bag he was holding and said,
"I baked some bread today. Give it to your daughter."
She refused many times, but he kept saying,
"You know, lots of the children are usually hungry at this time.
or,
This is a really delicious one."
it's hard to ignore him when he's been recommending it not once or twice. So we were forced to take a paper bag and put it on my lap and waited to get to the next station we could get off. After a while, he talked to me again.
"Why aren't you eating?"
I didn't know what to do, so I said, "Oh, I just ate a lot, so I'm not hungry yet. I'll eat later." Then he asked me once again.
"I said, why aren't you eating?"
His facial expression was stiff and bizarre, so I still remember that moment vividly. I apologized politely and asked him inversely this time, "Why do you give me this bread instead of your daughter?" Then he replied,
"Oh, because I can't see my daughter anymore."
My mom, who was getting anxious, watched me quietly from the side and dragged me. "Sweetie, we're getting off soon, so we have to stand by the door." She took me to the closed door, and for 10 minutes before getting off, he kept looking at me. Just before we arrived at the station, he came to us and told like this,
"I gave you this. Why didn't you eat? Why? Why?"
We couldn't make a fuss while we were still in the subway, so we waited desperately to arrive at the station as soon as possible. Fortunately, we arrived at the station shortly after, and at that very moment, we left the subway as if we were running away. I thought about eating bread on our way home because of his favor. However, I was also a little suspicious that he tried to force me to eat it, so I ended up throwing it away eventually. The more I thought about it, the more creepy it was.
It happened when I was 7 years old. There was a small wig factory in my neighborhood, and lots of hair was always rolling around in front of the factory. I could see lots of men and women busily carrying boxes into the car. In addition, mannequin heads were scattered around the factory, so I sometimes played with them, kicking like a soccer ball. However, at some point, the people who were busy working at the wig factory were not seen, and there were many days when the shutters were always closed. One day when I was walking by the factory with my mom, she looked at the closed factory and said, "They said wigs don't sell very well these days. I guess they're going to close the factory." A few days later, I was playing hide and seek with my friends in the neighborhood until dinner time. It was a long winter day, so it was already dark, and I, who was a tagger, couldn't find one of my friends. When I finally gave up, he showed up and said he was hiding in the wig factory. "How did you get in when the shutters were closed?" "When you go to the back of the door, there's a pile of boxes on the wall, and you could step on them and go in through the window. There was a shelf under the window, so you could step on it and come back out." I thought it was a good idea. And as soon as the next tagger was decided, I ran to the factory with one friend. It was very easy to step on the box and go inside, as he said. The moonlight came through the window so we could see inside the factory. Mannequin heads with wigs on them were lined on the shelves. Since they were all looking at the wall, we could only see the back of the mannequin's head. Now that I think about it, I would have been chilled to see all the black hairs, but it would have been no big deal for a 7-year-old who was just distracted by hide and seek. So me and my friend waited for the tagger, giggling with each other, but there was no sign of him when time went by. We eventually came out of the window again and decided to play one last game before going to dinner. I became a tagger again this time. After counting 10, I went around looking for my friends, and finally, the last two were left. I grinned and headed straight to the Wig Factory and shouted as I pushed my face through the window. "I won't be fooled twice. I know you're there, so get out of there." I went to the window to find friends who didn't answer. And then I felt something different from before. One of the heads of the mannequins, which were all looking at the wall, was looking at me. The moment I made eye contact with it, I felt like my whole body was electrocuted, and my heart dropped because the mannequin had a torso, unlike other mannequins. I was so surprised that I started screaming and crying, but no one came to see me, as if they didn't hear me. The mannequin was constantly shaking from side to side, or moving little by little, spinning in place. When I came to my senses, I took the courage to come closer to it, and I could see its face was very pale, and the eyes were unfocused. It was an old man. He was hanging from the ceiling on the pillar next to the shelf, and his face and his body were facing me as the rope turned. Being surprised, I immediately left the window and ran home crying. I told my parents all the truth as soon as I arrived, and they also reported to the police immediately, feeling serious. My dad, who went to the factory, kept comforting me in case I was terrified and shocked. However, I ended up suffering from what happened that day as a nightmare for a fairly long time. Later, according to the conversation of the elders in the neighborhood, the Wig Factory was suffering from financial difficulties, and the owner of the factory, who was in debt because of it, eventually closed the factory that day and hung himself. And a suicide note was also found nearby. The corpse I saw for the first time in my immature days gave me a mental trauma. And after that, I could no longer watch the scene that people hang themselves in movies or dramas, even now.
It's about when I was 21. I had a friend named Steven. He was very nice, but had a really bad complex on his face. He had serious skin problems, and it was hard to meet people. Another friend around him always made fun of his face. So from some point on, he didn't go out of the house because he became a social misfit. He has always been stuck at home, like a ghost. I was his only friend. One day, when I went to his house to see him, I could see that he was getting darker and worse. All kinds of caffeine drinks were piled up on his desk, and his appearance was getting worse. There's something he's into these days, and it's the deep web. I think he enjoyed watching all the stimulating things on the deep web and feeling out of touch with the world. In the deep web's world, you could see the things which don't happen in the real world. I feel like he wanted to escape reality like that. Worried, I told him to quit, but he didn't listen. One day, while I was playing at his house, he found some kind of terrible site on the deep web, and I could see lots of pictures of many people's skins and bones being separated. I was disgusted right away, but my friend Steven started to feel interest in. Is this all real? I told him to stop watching, but he kept digging the site. Start your new life. We'll make you have a new face. It was written in red letters like this. I think it was talking about taking off the skin of someone else's face and transplanting it. So it's kind of illegal plastic surgery. Does this make any sense? It's nonsense. I'm sure it's a fake site that someone just made to make fun of others. However, Steven sent an email there, and a few days later, he disappeared. And he still hasn't shown up so far. No one has ever seen him, including his family. But you know what? When I looked out the window from my house sometimes, there was a man looking at my house from afar. He was very handsome. He would look at my house for a while as if he were thinking about something, and then disappeared. At first, I thought he was just confused about the address or had something to do around here. One day, something came to my memory suddenly. Was that Steven? Maybe he showed up with his new face and came to see me. Of course, I still miss him, and I do believe he's alive, somewhere.
I grew up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. My family moved up there when I was about 6 months old. I was originally born in a small town called Mount Clemens. It's the same town that Dean Cain from The Adventures of Lewis and Clark was born in. I suppose that's my biggest claim to fame. Michigan is quite a unique state, the way it's positioned on the northern border of the US and the southern border of Canada. Those of us that are born in Michigan usually stay here, and no one ever travels to my neck of the woods. There's no real way to just pass by, and we're landlocked by the Great Lakes, if that makes sense. With the exception of the large cities, the state is mostly covered by woodlands. I have a few strange experiences living in the Upper Peninsula, but none stranger than the one I'm about to tell. We lived on top of a hill, about a 30-minute drive to the nearest town. Our next-door neighbors were a good 10 miles away. It was quiet. Few, if any, vehicles ever came by the house. I developed a strange fear of vehicles coming up the hill. It seemed like you could hear them for miles. I mean, of course, there were others who lived on our road, but this wasn't a place for outsiders to take shortcuts. We didn't even have names for our roads. They were all designated by numbers. When I got older, I wasn't too excited or afraid when vehicles would pass by. During the day, I knew most of the cars and trucks that our distant neighbors drove. When night came, well, that was a different story. I could see the headlights cutting through my bedroom window and light up my walls like some kind of ominous paint. It's a hard feeling to describe, but in my young mind, I felt that no one had any business driving down such a remote road at any point after dark. At the time, I was about 13. The year was 1996. Our family, amazingly, had just acquired internet. Anyone that's in their mid to late 30s knows how insane this time was. For whatever reason, at this time, my dad installed a glass sliding door on the wall near where the computer was. The computer used to be the hub of our home at the time, unlike nowadays where every family member has their own computer, plus a billion other gadgets in their pocket. So having the sliding door open up to the scenery of the countryside from the computer desk was actually pretty nice. I appreciated it for about 2 days, before one of the strangest things I've ever seen occurred. I was up late on a Saturday night on the computer, like usual. In those days, I was probably messing around in the Yahoo chat rooms, or maybe playing Myst. Then I heard it. I mostly felt it at first, the low rumbling of a truck engine, creeping slowly down the main road. The truck passed by our house, and then stopped. The long-forgotten fear I mentioned earlier came roaring back like a freight train. Nothing good would come from a suspicious truck driving down our road at 1 o'clock in the morning. What I saw next has burned itself inside my head. I can still recall it as clear as day. The truck screeched to a stop. A man flung open the passenger side door and quickly hustled over to the driver's side. This was all taking place too far away for me to give a really good physical description, but I could tell the passenger was much larger than the driver. He wore some kind of puffy vest, jeans, and one of those trucker-style caps. He grabbed the driver and dragged him out of the truck, then slammed him against the tailgate. He seemed to be shouting orders at the driver, motioning him to open the tailgate. When he did, I saw the driver turn to the bigger guy, as if he was hesitating out of fear. Even at a distance, I could see this clearly. The driver was unnerved, and his partner forcefully handed him a shovel. The passenger then pointed to a spot on the side of the road behind the truck. The panicked driver began to frantically dig where the passenger had pointed to. He dug for about 3 to 4 minutes, paused, then looked at the driver, and the two exchanged some words that I couldn't quite make out. The passenger then dragged something out of the bed of the truck. I can only describe it as a closed sleeping bag, with a body still inside. The passenger walked over to the shallow grave. and tossed it in. The two men then made a poor attempt of covering the hole before they sped off. You may be asking, well, did you go out and see what they buried? And the answer is surely what you would expect. Of course I did. And that's the creepiest part of all. When I went out to the road the next morning, the hole was empty. I knew what I saw. There was even the tire tracks from the night before. But whatever they threw into that hole was gone. I looked to the opposite side of the burial and was horrified to see footprints in the dirt leading straight into the forest. I had no idea what to make of it. I've repressed this memory for so long and just wanted to pretend that it never happened. Aside from a few close friends, I've never told anyone about this. I believe that bag they threw into the ground had someone in it, and they thought that person was dead. However, based on what I saw the next morning, they were wrong. You can chalk this all up to teenage imagination if you like, but I stand by what I say. There are some things in this world that you'll never be able to explain, and even if you could, chances are you wouldn't care much for the answer.
This happened 7 years ago. I was a freshman in middle school at that time, and I was interested in graphics, so I was attending an academy to learn 3D Max. The academy lasted 4 hours every weekend, but anyway, I really didn't want to go that day. The reason was that I just felt bored. So I decided not to attend the academy that day, but I had no money. So I sat at the bus stop playing cell phone games for 30 minutes. Feeling bored, I ended up heading in front of my house, praying for my father not to be there. And then I thought of an idea. Maybe I could just ring the doorbell to find out. This is a method of verification that I'm still using well. However, there was only one small problem. I had to hide well so that I wouldn't be caught because my dad shouldn't see me when he came out. It's impossible to run and hide because the hallway is wide. Fortunately, my house is on the first floor, so I could jump over to the parking lot right in front of me to hide. Anyway, I pressed the doorbell after deciding my mind, but there was no response from inside my house. I couldn't judge immediately, since he usually slept in the room during the daytime on weekends. So I pressed it 3 more times and a little relieved that no one came out. I was sure that no one was at home. However, I was more careful because I felt guilty for no reason when I did any bad thing. He might pretend he's not home, knowing I'm the one pressing the button. I went back to the apartment, checking the balcony of the apartment, and even asked the security office. But my doubts didn't go away. In the end, there was only one way left: to call home. Fortunately, our phone didn't show the phone number at the time. So I decided to make a phone call. Just as I tried to put the phone down after hearing 5 times of phone signals, someone answered the phone. I was so surprised that I hung up right away. However, I called one more time because it was too cold outside and I wanted to play on a computer at my cozy home. Again, someone answered the phone, and this time I could hear a breathing sound over the phone. I thought it was the sound of my dad's breath because I remembered he caught a cold at that time. And I could not stay out any longer. So I ended up entering the apartment with a ridiculous excuse that the academy ended early. However, I couldn't sense any presence of people as soon as I came inside. "Dad? You not here?" I was glad that I wasn't scolded. But first of all, I checked some stuff, just in case. How dry the toilet water is, how warm the TV setup box is, or how warm the bed is, etc. And it was concluded that there was no one at home for about 3 hours. In the midst of joy about his absence, I suddenly felt chilled and got goosebumps. Then, who answered the phone earlier? Feeling terrified, I looked carefully around the house, but there was no one. and my parents, who were out, soon returned, and I forgot about it a few moments later. But now that I think about it, I think maybe there's an intruder inside the house. He might have been hiding somewhere in the house, and he probably sneaked out while I was in the bathroom. If I had encountered him at that time, I might not have been writing this now.
I'm 21 years old. This happened to me shortly after I turned 18 and graduated high school. My family moved to a new house in Texas. My mother claimed that it was so we could get a fresh start, but I knew the truth. She was ashamed of all the trouble that my sister Jocelyn had gotten into in our hometown. Weeks later, after we settled into the new house, Jocelyn disappeared. My mother received a phone call from my sister's parole officer. Apparently they found her in Atlanta. And to make a long story short, Jocelyn wasn't thrilled about the move, so she ran away to a friend's house. Unfortunately, I couldn't fly back to Georgia with my mom, and I had no choice but to stay in Texas. The next morning after my mom left, I went for a jog around the new neighborhood to familiarize myself. It was when I stopped to catch my breath and change playlists on my phone that I felt a cold feeling creep up my spine. It was the unmistakable sensation that you get when you're being watched. I looked around, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. But I knew that someone was watching me from somewhere close by. I decided to cut my walk short. As soon as I reached my house, I locked the doors and immediately ran upstairs to take a quick shower. While I was washing up, I heard a faint thud from downstairs. I quickly turned off the shower and listened. Another thud followed. I quickly threw on my clothes and ran downstairs to check things out, but there was nothing. The front and patio doors were locked, so I was left feeling a little confused. Trying my best to keep my composure, I was finally able to breathe when my mom called to check up on me. I didn't want my mom to be worried about me. She was already stressing out enough because of the situation with my sister, so I told her that I was fine and that I was going to order takeout and chill for the rest of the day. Later that night, around 10 p.m., I finished up my dinner while binge-watching How to Get Away with Murder on Netflix, and eventually fell asleep on the couch. I suddenly woke up a couple of hours later. It was around 1 a.m., and the room was freezing. The thermostat showed 42 degrees. That's when that dreadful feeling came back. I felt like a deer being eyeballed by an apex predator. Danger was close by. My stomach felt like I was doing somersaults. Something was very wrong, and that's when I noticed that my phone was missing. After a brief search on the couch, I couldn't find it. Annoyed, I decided to use a website called Text Now on my laptop. It's a free online service that I sometimes use to track my misplaced phone. Trembling, I typed in my number. Almost immediately, the ringtone abruptly stopped, and that's when I heard heavy breathing coming from the other end. I barely had enough time to respond when I heard a knocking on the glass of the patio doors. I grabbed an unscrewed bedpost from the closet before checking things out. When I looked out through the doors, my heart stopped. Holding my phone was a dark figure in a goat mask. Before I can make out any other details, the masked man slid my patio door open. At the speed of light, I burst through the front doors and headed for my neighbor's house across the street. There, I banged on the door until an older woman came to greet me. She immediately called the police after I explained everything to her. The cops arrived 10 minutes later, and after a thorough search of my house, they found no trace of the intruder. After that ordeal, there was no way I was staying in that house alone, so I asked the officers if I could accompany them to the station, to which they obliged. While I was at the station, one of the officers informed me that they had located my phone outside the house. However, since there were no fingerprints on it, Added to the fact that I couldn't give a detailed description of the assailant, it was a dead end. There was one last unpleasant surprise when I unlocked my phone to call my mom. Upon seeing what was in my photo gallery, my blood ran cold. The officer saw that I was uneasy and asked me what was wrong. I handed him the phone. There was about 15 videos of me sleeping on the couch, each nearly 3 minutes long. The masked man that I saw had been inside my house and was watching me while I was sleeping. I felt so violated that I became nauseous and called my mom and told her everything. Hours later, she and my sister came straight from the airport to come get me. We didn't live in that house much longer after that. For the longest time, I couldn't stop thinking about what could have happened if I had woken up with that man standing over me. Perhaps I wouldn't be here to tell you this story. It took a while, but I finally came to terms with what happened. But I would be lying if I told you that this experience doesn't haunt me to this day.
This is one of my friends, Mary's story, but she's not here anymore. So this happened after she met a guy. One day, Mary made a new boyfriend who said his job was an actor. She would show me some pictures and he definitely had a nice face that everybody would fall in love with him. I was jealous of my friend. However, I still can't believe what happened. Although he said he was an actor, he never appeared in a movie, nor did earn any income. He was actually a would-be actor. According to my friend, he had no acting skills or any qualifications as an actor at all. So he was such a playboy, just a man who was confident of his handsome face. The two seemed to meet well, but their argument and fight always continued. The reason they fought was quite unusual. He always said he wants to be the main role of serial killer movies as a killer, and always forced Mary to act in the opposite role. At first, she did that for him because she loved him. However, he became more and more seriously immersed and began to actually hit or hurt her at some point. He realized his mistake soon after he got out of the immersion, but he didn't feel much guilt about it. That's why she was always hurt, and once he almost stabbed her with a knife. I told her to break up right away, but she was already felt love in him so deeply that she couldn't easily break up with him. She insisted that the rest was fine except for that. It was about 3 months after they met. One day, I got a video call from her. Beyond the screen, she was seen in the hotel room and her boyfriend standing right behind her. While Mary was smiling and talking to me, he was staring at me without any word. He was glaring at my face through the screen. He rummaged through his bag and took out a small hand axe. Then he came up and began to spit out some kind of lines to Mary. She looked confused and asked him, "What are you doing, babe?" For no reason, he became more and more furious, mumbled something, and hacked at her head with an axe. The cell phone fell from her hand to the floor, and soon I couldn't see them through on the screen. I screamed. After I heard some horrible smashing sound for a while, the sound stopped. The footsteps followed and he finally picked up the phone. His face was all covered with blood and he was smiling with his gums. Finally, I did it. My first movie. How is my acting? Isn't it fun? Hey, clap your hands. Clap! If you don't clap, I'll cut your friend's neck. He put the axe around her neck and I had to pretend clap, crying. My mind was coming over faint. He put the cell phone on the shelf, lifted her dead body up, and smiled at me with a V sign, as if he were taking a commemorative photograph. Being terrified, I screamed, hung up the phone, and immediately called the police. As soon as they arrived at the scene, that guy was immediately arrested by the police and ended up being imprisoned. Until the end, he claims that he is an actor, and that he is innocent because what he did is just a part of acting.
My name is Aditi. I have my best friend who is extremely close to me since she has now moved in with me and my family. For your information, she is 7 years older than me. She grew up in a small town, and a lot of murders and gruesome incidents occurred there. One of the scary incidents that she told me still causes me to send shivers down my spine. So this happened to her when she was 11 years old. There was a young, kind, and extremely beautiful woman in her town who was happily married to her husband. They lived in conjugal harmony, but there was something, a dark secret that she was hiding. The woman, who we'll refer to as Veronica, had a child, and that baby was not her husband's. She couldn't let her husband know about this, as this baby was the result of one of her old affairs. She was 8 years old then, and has been living at one of her friend's houses. Veronica used to visit her friend's house to meet her child secretly every night after her husband fell into sleep. However, when her husband had returned home late from work one day, then he realized that his wife wasn't home. Worried, he started looking for Veronica desperately. He had continued searching everywhere in town until he decided to check at her friend's house. When he finally arrived at her house, he noticed Veronica talking and laughing with a child. Wondering who the girl was, he stood behind a tree and started to eavesdrop on their conversation. And when he heard every conversation between them, then he ended up realizing that his wife cheated on him, got pregnant, and even gave birth, who was not his baby. This pissed him off enough, so he eventually created the most horrifying plan. One night, he put sleeping pills in her coffee, which caused her to sleep for 12 hours. Eventually, Veronica could not meet her child that evening, and he snuck into her friend's house to kidnap the child. After kidnapping her, then he took her to a dense forest. She was crying. Then he smiled the creepiest way and said, "You are going to meet your mommy." She continued crying and tried to escape, but she couldn't get out, as she was buried from head to toe in soil. She was never seen after that. A week later, her body was found in the ground, and this made Veronica deeply shocked. And it turned out that her husband had actually dug a hole and threw her in. He soon arrested by police and was finally sentenced for his crime. However, Veronica couldn't get out of the grief for her lost child and ended up falling sick in bed for a long time. It has been 9 years since this happened, but he still remains in jail.
One of my friends was living in a dormitory for a while. He ended up renting a room after fighting with his roommate, who did not get along well. The house was very cheap, near the school, and the transportation around it was quite comfortable. So he signed the contract right away, saying he was lucky. I was doubtful of the ridiculously cheap price, but shrugged it off, thinking, hope everything's okay. But nothing much happened for a year. However, I couldn't see my friend at some point. He was not seen not only in the classroom, but also in frequently visited restaurants, bars, or anywhere else at all. First of all, I began to worry about him. Thinking there might be something urgent going on in his house, I kind of put down my worries. It had been more than 5 days. Being nervous, I ended up going to his house. However, there was no answer from inside, no matter how many times I knocked and called his name. Thinking he might have really gone to his home, I was about to turn around, and I inadvertently turned the doorknob of his house. But somehow the door was open. Hey, are you in there? The moment I went inside, I couldn't move at all, getting goosebumps all over my body. The walls of the living room were covered with blood. Strangely, there were countless bloodstains on the walls of the height of the doorknob only, as if they were dotted with some kind of red paint. At that moment, I noticed that someone who looked like my friend was curled up in a blanket on the bed. I headed to the bed carefully. Hey, I was worried. What happened? Saying this, I tried to roll up the blanket with one hand, but it didn't go up easily. It felt like the blanket had attached to something, so I tried to lift it with both hands. The moment I lifted it, it fell off with a sticky noise. And it was my friend, who was dead with blood all over his body. After his blood flowed from the body and hardened, the blanket and body were stuck together. His eyes were wide open, and he seemed to be in extreme fear right before he died. I screamed and immediately reported it to the police. They initially suspected me, who was the first discoverer, but soon after, when the autopsy and investigation were over, they gave me the details. The cause of his death was excessive bleeding. The other part of his body was perfectly fine, and he had no stab wounds or cuts. But every second joint of his 10 fingers was torn out. All the blood on the wall belongs to my friend, and almost half his blood was gone. It was concluded that he died of excessive bleeding while tapping and scratching on the wall, so that his fingers all torn out. It didn't make sense. Perhaps he saw something in the room and found a doorknob to escape, but couldn't open it. The blood was covered on the wall only, because he knocked the wall about the height of a doorknob frantically. And later, he hid under the blanket for some reason, but eventually died because of too much bleeding. Then, what was it my friend did see in his room?
This is the first time I've told this story in a manner like this. Now, I'm not a native English speaker or writer. I live in Brazil, and my family do not have anything extraordinary about them. My dad's an engineer and my mother is a psychologist. I'm 30 now, but this story occurred when I was maybe 10 or 11, sometime in that gap. It was the period of school break. Here it occurs in the middle of the year. So me, my cousin, who was a little older, maybe 13, and her brother, who was the same age, went to our grandparents' house. They lived in the countryside. They live in a state called Minas Gerais. We went to stay for about 7 days. The first 6 days were perfect. Not too cold, not too hot, the relaxing sound of animals, the fresh smell of coffee every day, that delicious farm food that my grandma did so well. A true paradise for a child. And then the night of the 6th day. I'll never forget that. The sounds, the sensations. For some reason, that day I was having trouble sleeping. My cousins were already fast asleep. I decided to walk to the kitchen to get a cup of water or something to drink. With luck, we would have some Coca-Cola in there. When I made it to the kitchen, I found my 2 uncles, who lived on the farm ground to help my grandparents with all the farm things and all that. They were talking about something. When they saw me, they smiled and continued their conversation. I don't remember what they were talking about, but it was lighthearted. Then one of them closed the door. I saw that there was an enormous quantity of locks on the door, including one that was a wooden bar that was placed horizontally over it. I didn't say anything, I just grabbed my water, then drank it before going back to our room. Later on in the night, I was awakened by the sounds of loud voices. I looked around a little lost, and I saw my cousin holding her sister in his arms. She was crying a lot and said, "You hear that, Matthias? when she saw that I was awake. I then heard one of my uncles screaming, "It's coming back!" Soon after, I heard the first gunshot I'd ever heard in my life. I think it was a hunting rifle. I'm not a weapons guy, so I don't know the type. I nearly screamed. Then one of my uncles went into the room, a rifle in his hands. He saw us and seemed relieved. He smiled, but before he went back, he told us, "Stay away from the windows." And we did just that. For the next hour, I think, we three just got together and waited. I swear I remember the sound of something big circling around the property. It reminded me of when a dog walks, the sound of 4 legs hitting the ground. The sound of heavy breathing came really close to our window. Then there was a bang. My cousin screamed, and my uncle came into the room and led us to the kitchen. He never lost sight of that window, training the gun there. Then there was nothing. Just dead silence. We slept in the kitchen, and one of my uncles stayed awake all night with us. In the morning, all seemed like a bad dream. But then I went out because I loved the smell of grass in the morning, and I saw these huge claw marks on the outside of the door. They looked 6 centimeters wide, enormous, and these huge dog-like footprints were around the house too. I asked the uncle that took us out of our room, and he said to me, like it was normal, "Well, this is our life here."
I was in high school when this all happened. This was back in 2016, and I had recently started walking home from school. I didn't live too far. It was only around a 20 to 30 minute walk, depending on how much I wanted to go home that day. The school day had just ended, and this was my 5th or 6th time walking home. I decided that I would go the long route instead of the shorter one that I normally take. Little did I know what I was walking into. After getting out of the parking lot, there was a long road that led to a neighborhood just behind the school. On one side of the road, there was the baseball field, and on the other was a small factory-looking place. Usually I would follow this road down into the neighborhood and cut through there until I reached the main road, where I'd be roughly 15 minutes away from home. So I climbed up the side of the hill between the back road and the factory place and began my walk through. There were multiple buildings on each side of the path I was walking on. I had headphones on because it's what I usually did when I walked home. Only this time, since the only cars that would pose a threat, if any, would come from where I can see them. So instead of having one side in, I had both sides in, blaring loud enough to drown out any noise surrounding me. It was a joyful walk for the most part. I kept swapping between staring at the sky and the trees behind some of the smaller-sized buildings. It was the middle of spring, and I live in Michigan, so I appreciate the small breeze and greenery when it finally rolls around. I had walked past one of the buildings, but it seemed off compared to the rest of them. This one had no windows, and the outside of it was worn down, like someone had been chipping away at it for a while with a chisel. I brushed it off like it was nothing, and continued on walking. However, during the time that it took for the song I was currently listening to swap to the next, I heard an extremely loud scream. I took my headphones off and let them rest around my neck. I stood confused for a few seconds, wondering if I was imagining things, or if it was part of the song. After those few seconds, another scream filled my ears, only much louder than the one before. Now, if you ever hear something like this when you're walking somewhere, I advise you to stop what you're doing, find out where you're at, and call 911 to report it. I decided to check it out and see if everything was okay. The screams sounded almost staged, but I couldn't be sure without checking it out for myself. I walked up to the building so I could look through the holes in the door. It looked old and had a fair bit of rust around it, so it was an average peephole, but more of a rusted away you need to replace this door kind of hole. I looked inside, and what I saw made my stomach turn, faster than I ever thought it could. Inside was a man, He was wearing all black and a mask that you probably could buy at a party store, if I had to guess. There was also a woman who was on the floor. She had bruises and blood stains on her shirt. The man was holding a hammer that had blood covering the tip of it. I cannot go into detail of what I saw next, but it was the most disturbing thing I have ever seen. I had the sudden urge to throw up. I backed away from the door and threw up, only nothing came out because I hadn't eaten much that day. A few seconds after that, I heard the sound of the man's shoes practically stomping on the floor inside the building, and they were getting closer. I gathered my composure quickly and started to pull out my phone when the door swung open and the man stepped out. I pretended that I had been recording the entire thing to hopefully scare the guy into letting me live if I told him I wouldn't tell anyone if he would let me go. He proceeded to slam the door shut after a few minutes of us standing there, staring at each other without muttering a single word. My heart was beating so fast that I was beginning to be distracted by it, as well as the fear that this could be my last moment. After he slammed the door and went back inside, I took off running and immediately called 911. They stayed on the line with me until I got far enough away to feel safe telling them my location. A couple cop cars showed up roughly 6 to 7 minutes later, and I pointed them to the building. There were 4 of them. When they came back, nobody else was with them. The man had taken off during the short amount of time he had and must have taken the woman with him. They found some hair and blood on the floor, but other than that, it was as if the two were never there to begin with. The police never found the guy, and I never saw any reports or articles about a missing woman or a woman that was killed. After that day, I never walked home again. I always either rode the bus or had one of my parents pick me up. About half a year after that, I eventually transferred to an alternative high school that was much farther away from those buildings than my old school. I was 16 at the time, and I am currently 20, going on 21 in August, and this incident has been with me ever since. I have always been skeptical about situations around me, but after that, I was never even close to the same again.